Hello and welcome to another episode of the WWFM podcast. I'm your host, Doug Casterton, and today I have someone truly extraordinary joining us, a person who's spent over 3 decades championing forecasting and resource planning solutions across industries from utilities to retail, and who's even counted the legendary David Hasselhoff among his more memorable encounters. Our guest is Philip Stubbs, partner at Atlantic Insight. Philip brings a unique blend of academic rigor and hands-on know-how, which he's honed over the years of delivering major performance improvements for contact centers, back office, and field operations. In addition to having led high-impact teams at organizations like British Gas and JD Williams, Philip has also expanded into machine learning and Python-based forecasting, showing us all how modern data science can solve long-standing WFM challenges. He's even published research on demand forecasting in the utilities industries, proving that he's not just talking the talk, but also deeply committed to innovation and evidence-based strategies. So buckle up for a conversation that's going to blend practical advice, future-focused perspectives, and maybe even a few surprising anecdotes. You're about to learn from one of the most passionate resource planning experts in the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Philip Stubbs. Philip, I'm super happy to have you on the WWFM podcast. It's been over a year for me since I've done a podcast recording. So to have someone with your caliber and expertise on here is brilliant. And yeah, welcome to the WWFM podcast. Great to have you.
Thank you very much, Doug. And this is the first podcast or interview that I've done. So I'm a little bit nervous.
Absolutely natural. So for the audience out there, could you just share a little bit about yourself and how you first found yourself drawn to forecasting, resource planning, and supporting contact centers?
Sure. I think we've got to go back to the 1980s to answer this question, really. While I was doing my A-levels, I was doing maths, physics, and business studies. As part of the business studies A-level course, we did a small amount on operational research. Operational research is the application of mathematics and statistical techniques to operational, to management, to business problems. And it contains a lot of different individual techniques, such as forecasting, simulation, queuing theory, marketing analysis, and decision-making under uncertainty. And I liked the little bit of operational research that I did within my business studies A-level, and I decided to study it at university. So I did a degree in management studies and operational research. Then I did a master's degree in operational research at Lancaster University. That was fascinating and a lot of hard work, but it gave me my first taste of forecasting. My summer project as part of the master's degree was forecasting gas demand for British Gas. This was 1990. I was using statistical techniques and I was using SAS software to look at the historical data, look at the causes of variation of natural gas demand within the UK, which was temperature, wind speed, day of week predominantly, and applying many different complex models to try and identify the one that delivered the lowest error.
It's always an interesting question because I don't think anybody grows up or goes to school thinking, I want to get into resource planning, I want to get into workforce management. It's just fall into it. And I think that's the first time I've ever heard like the academic research route taking you into that discipline. That's super interesting.
And I got a job within the operational research department at British Gas.
Okay.
And there was many different projects. I owned the gas demand forecasting, but we also did some contact center modeling for British Gas. And this was the early days of contact centers in the early 90s. And British Gas there was a national British Gas company. It had been privatized. It had 12 regions, I recall. And within the region, there were 3 billing contact centers. And I think there was maybe 10 British Gas service. They weren't contact centers. They were just bureau with just a few people in them. One of the jobs that we did was using queuing theory and simulation models, demonstrate how much better it would be if we had the one big contact center. That led to the ACDs coming in to British Gas and the contact centers being formed.
So you literally seen the advent of the first centralized contact centers.
Yeah, and my first job after British Gas was working for Mercury Communications, which was part of Cable and Wireless.
Mm-hmm.
I joined what was a state-of-the-art pioneering contact centre, the Concord Business Park contact centre at Wythenshawe, which is now part of Virgin Media. And it was terrific to be there right at the start because we were pioneering lots of different methods. That we didn't know of anyone else who was doing this in the contact center planning. When we started, we didn't have a WFM. We invented a lot of techniques for capacity planning. It's interesting to hear other experts who were around at the time that we have no contact with, and they make the same mistakes as we did, and make the same learning points, and slowly develop the similar capacity planning tools in similar ways. And there was no internet. You couldn't go online and ask ChatGPT how to do X, Y, and Z.
When I first entered workforce planning, it was really difficult to find outside views of best practice. And I definitely recognize at least 20 years ago, there wasn't a lot of professionals speaking to each other. And it's quite amazing that we've all kind of converged into very similar processes and disciplines now. And I know because we were talking online prior to this recording that you've also had some interesting visits during your time as well. I was going to mention that I once was in a contact center when Nelson Mandela and his security staff entered, which was my story for interesting visits.
Yeah,
but I understand you had one as well.
I can't compete with a visit from Nelson Mandela, from the less iconic David Hasselhoff. But to many people, blame that he's responsible for the fall of the Berlin Wall. But I don't think that really does stand the test. But it is very much disputed. But I was working for Pipex, a fixed line telephony and broadband business, which had been spun out of the Phones 4U group. We ran a series of adverts on TV featuring David Hasselhoff. And much to our surprise, we were told one day that David Hasselhoff was going to visit the contact centre, our operation in Manchester. He had a tour of the place and arrived in customer services. And then he came up to see us. I was responsible for showing him around telemarketing.
Oh, so you got to meet him as well?
I met him, toured him around and chatted with him as he went. What was absolutely appalling for him was the fact that there was posters, there was things hanging from the door, there were things stuck to the windows, there was mouse mats, things on the screen. It was wherever you looked, there was hundreds of images of him. And he said, "This is sick." It was just like John Malkovich going inside John Malkovich in the film, being John Malkovich. It was very wrong for him. But we were in the planning team responsible for forecasting the response because the adverts that were on TV came through into the contact center, into telemarketing. And luckily, most of the adverts, there was a lot of adverts, but they were mostly played on the cable channels. So there was very small blips for each of those. So there was no dial this number now in the middle of Coronation Street or anything like that. Thankfully, we were able to hit the service levels throughout the campaign.
And you mentioned of films. So I know another kind of passion for you outside of resource planning and forecasting is films. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but you moonlight as a film journalist.
I occasionally get paid for it as well, which is very good. But with the contact center performance and contact center planning, forecasting and planning, it's easy to get obsessed. And with long opening hours, it's easy to take those obsessions out of the 9 to 5 and into the evenings and weekends. So it's good to have a separate outlet. For me, I've always enjoyed watching film and I've always admired the cinema of a particular film director, Terry Gilliam. He's famous for being in Monty Python. Yes. And he's famous for making The Fisher King with Robin Williams and Jeff Bridges and 12 Monkeys with Bruce Willis, amongst a host of other films. But it was in the mid-90s. If you want to find out about movies in the 1990s, you can read books, you can read magazines, and you can read the daily newspaper. And that's pretty much it. The internet was just starting in the mid-90s. And I thought, wouldn't it be a great idea to put a website together and to have all the information, like bit from the books, bit from magazine, bit of news, bit of things from the past, put it onto a website and update it? Would that be great? I'm still editing this fanzine at GilliamDreams.com, dedicated to Terry's work.
Wow.
It takes a big decision to stop doing something. As the years have gone by, I've interviewed him a few times I visited the set of a number of the movies that he's made. For example, Brothers Grimm with Matt Damon and Heath Ledger. The most recent one was The Man Who Killed Don Quixote with Adam Driver and Jonathan Pryce and Stellan Skarsgård. Now, by this time, I'm actually helping the publicity of the movies. So I was recording video that ended up on the DVD release. And I've done that for the last few movies and writing some publicity material. But on The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, it was shooting in Portugal in a convent. And when I was there, it was night shoots, starting when it goes dark and ending at dawn. I'd done some interviews, including with Stellan Skarsgård and Jonathan Pryce, and I had to move some chairs from one part of the convent to the other in this Portuguese convent. Late at night, the lighting was very poor, and I broke 3 bones in my foot on this staircase. I couldn't finish my work. I was helped back to the hotel in Olga Kurilenko's Mercedes. I was able to get back to the hotel, but I woke up the next day and had to go to a hospital. Had to get an ambulance to another hotel. I had no idea where I was. Thankfully, the film company got me back to the hotel, and I had to get back to Manchester the next day with a foot in plaster.
Wow. So from Hasselhoff to film journalism, you got multiple claims of fame and also in 24, so bringing it sort of more into the present, you were involved in the V1 forecasting competition and you were a co-winner. What was that about?
Yes. In 2024, one of my learning objectives was to learn Python, and in particular, use it for forecasting. Advantages of Python for forecasting. I mean, it means you've got access to complex statistical and machine learning methods to prepare the data and perform the tests. You have to create Python code, but you can do things in Python with such economy that you can't do within an Excel spreadsheet. For example, you can use the same data set and have some code to calculate forecasts for 10 different models. Then you can loop round an error calculation routine, which might be 4 or 5 lines long. But imagine doing that within an Excel spreadsheet. You'd have to have one tab for one forecasting method, another tab for another forecasting method, and maybe multiple calculations over multiple time periods. So you're talking about multiple tabs within an Excel spreadsheet. It can get very overcomplicated, whereas Python can really help you manipulate that data really well. So I was very keen to do that. My 2 boys are learning Python as well at school, so it was something we could all do together in some way. Having learned Python and done my own experiments, both with the statistical models and machine learning, the VN1 competition towards the end of 24 came at exactly the right time for me to put those skills to the test. Now, what was the VN1 competition? There was a $20,000 cash prizes on offer, which was attractive. And there was 2 years, but it was the learning that was the most important thing. And then we were given data, which was 2 years of sales history for over 15,000 products across 47 different clients. So it was 47 different businesses, 15,000 products. And in phase 1, we had to submit a comma-separated file with 15,000 rows with 13 weeks of our forecasted sales. There was 2 phases. In phase 1, just a bit of a warm-up, really. But what we could do is we could submit our forecasts. We weren't told what the actuals were, but we were told what the error was. I got started using Python. I created a 4-week moving average or a 4-week weighted average, 0.3 times the week before that, plus 2, plus 0.2, plus 0.1. So it was a weighted average of the last 4 weeks, which would give me a baseline. And I always love doing that because it can often be a really hard model to beat. So create a forecast based on that. And I submitted the forecast. I didn't know what the actuals were, but it returned an error of 0.63. I then did 2 separate statistical models. There was a seasonal ARIMA model that got it down to 0.55. And separately, I did a seasonal index model, which was pretty much you take an anchor point, what like October, and then see how much higher than October is that week in November, that week in December. It might be 20% up or 50% up. And then what I did was I just saw what the anchor point was in the next year's October, and then I applied those same indices to the October number. It's something I've used in contact centers a lot, particularly for the Christmas holidays, because it can be modeled as a proportion of October or November values. But anyway, my seasonal index method got me an error. The 0.63 came down to 0.55, and the seasonal ARIMA separately got me to 0.55 as well. So that was an improvement of 0.08 on the baseline. Now, what I then did was combined those two models together. So for every product for every week, I said, let's take 50% of one forecast and 50% of the other forecast, sort of simple average of the two. And by doing that, it got me from 0.55 to 0.53. And the 0.53 put me pretty high up in the table. But then my attention turned to machine learning models. But I wasn't able to get anything quite as good as that with the machine learning model as my statistical models. And I tried and tried. Now, at the same time as this, it was close to phase 2, in fact, phase 1 ending. So I reached out to Jakub Figura, an analyst from Poland. He talked about a machine learning model that had got a score that was 0.52 using light GBM, which I'd played with, but hadn't done particularly well with. So I reached out to him and said, let's see what happens if we merge your machine learning model with the ensemble that I'd got. And he did a 50-50 again between my combination and his light GBM model. And we got it down to below 0.5. So it was a massive improvement just by combining the models. And so it was a real learning to me. I knew that combining models was good, but I hadn't anticipated just how good it was. Combining the models helps to rein in some of the errors that each is making, and you end up with a better overall than either can create on their own, which was a great win. A great learning for me was seeing Jakub's code, and the difference that he'd made in his light GBM model compared to mine was all in the feature engineering. Feature engineering is where you take the historical data of what you're trying to forecast and the independent variables, and you manipulate them in such a way that they can be useful for the machine learning model. So having collaborated with Jakub on phase 1, we got near the top of the table with our combined forecast. We were on to phase 2. The difference with phase 2 is you've only got one go at it. There was no, let's submit it and see what the score is. You only had one shot at getting the forecast right. And we worked together as a team. And so we used a similar model as we had before with a 45% GBM, 30% ARIMA, 25% seasonal index model. When the results were revealed, we found out that ours was the most accurate model. We were really pleased with that. And I learned a huge amount about feature engineering, which was the key difference between Jakub's model and my attempt.
That's super interesting. And there's a lot to unpack in terms of what you just shared. I just want to go back to one of the early things that you were mentioning around using the moving average as kind of your base. Why do you particularly like using a 4-week average as your baseline to compare forecasting?
Within contact centers, things change very quickly. There'll be some new routing that happens or a price change that can change the historical data significantly. I like to use the 4-week moving average or a 4-week weighted average because it's the right balance between getting data that's nice and recent together with making sure that you've got enough data to deal with any variation in the recent weeks.
Got it. It's interesting as well that the majority of workforce management systems don't go beyond the weighted 4-week moving average in terms of sophistication. A few weeks ago, I was on another podcast talking about workforce management software really has a place to catch up when it comes to the forecasting side of things. But my counter argument to that is exactly what you said, which is sometimes that's good enough. Going beyond that, you're just spending a lot of time and energy improving it for very marginal, or sometimes not even improving it, when, like you say, it actually can outcompete some of the more complex models. My question that runs on my head is, there something that makes it competitive versus going into the more sophisticated machine learning or statistical methods?
The thing about a 4-week moving average is if things don't change very much, it will hugely resemble what will happen next week and the week after. There are many reasons why a complex model can be outperformed by a simple model if they're not created correctly. For example, you could build a fantastic model that explains your customer service calls as a result of lagged sales. If the sales is this, then I can be extremely confident that the number of inquiry calls or inquiry emails is going to be this. But the trouble is the forecast of the sales may be extremely poor. And it may be that just taking the 4-week average will outperform a more complex model. Things like that bias in the inputs, poor model construction. So what I would always advise is to start simple and only add complexity to your forecasting model if you can demonstrate that it will give you extra accuracy.
Yeah, that's really great advice. The fact that you mentioned around it starting really as a learning opportunity to learn Python, I think is really fascinating. Is there any particular resources that you'd recommend if there is somebody going out to learn Python from a standing start like you did?
You can install Python with Anaconda and the Spider environment, and you can install it for free. Get that on your laptop and then mess around. You can download some games. So the first one I downloaded was Snake. Download that, get it to work, and you play the game and have a look how the code works. LinkedIn Learning, I found very good with lots of stuff about Python. I heartily recommend this book by Nicholas van der Put, Data Science for Supply Chain Forecasting. It's really good because it takes you through the early stages of Python, some statistical methods, and some machine learning methods as well. So great book, Nicholas.
There you go.
I really enjoyed it. Get some forecasting models going. Bring your own data. Bring call volumes, chats, emails. Bring it into Python. Bring in your historical forecasts as well, and calculate the error of your original forecast together with the actuals, and then create some alternative forecasts and see how accurate they would have been against your own historical forecasts. And you can start simple and then move complex. It is a really tough job because 5 to 10% of your efforts will give you something. There'll be as many occasions where you'll try something that you're sure will work, but then you'll try something else and it'll fail. But then as soon as you get an improvement, that becomes part of your forecast and you can build on that. So the gains that you can make are cumulative. Get your own data into Python, look at it there, you can chart it, you can analyze it, you can calculate the errors, and then try some new things.
And I love that advice as well, because so often I get the question around, how do I learn more around workforce management, whether that's not just forecasting? And do you know what? The best way often to learn something new is, like you just said there, get the foundations in place and start playing with it. Do something interesting that are actually going to expand. So I think that's really great advice. I'm guessing because, like, we touched on some of the history, you've seen the advent of contact centers during your time in the forecasting space. You've probably seen some cracking errors that have been made. What sort of common forecasting errors have you encountered in contact centers? And what would your advice be to avoid those?
Yeah, I would say number one is the most important thing with forecasting is getting reliable data. Data is everything. So I would say that whatever it is you are forecasting, be it calls or emails, chats, or items to be processed, I would say you've got to understand where that data comes from. So I would say know the database inside out. If somebody tells you this is call volume or this is the number of chats, you might actually be surprised that if you roll up your sleeves and have a look at the data, you might find that it's not exactly what you think it is. So in terms of forecasting errors, I would say the number one is actually forecasting something using data that is wrong. You must be entirely sure that the data you're using is correct. We talked a little bit before about using a complex forecasting model that can be outperformed by a simple one.
Yep.
I think now more than ever, but it's always been strong, is that it's important for a forecast analyst to reach out and network across the business. So don't just sit in a confined space and not talk to anyone. Reach out to understand the business. Within retail, for example, I've done a lot of work in retail. Marketing is very, very important, causes variation in volumes. In terms of fulfillment and what goes on at the distribution center, understand the cause of variation, identify who in the organization is responsible for that, and see what you can do to forecast better. And it may be that, for example, with statements, if there's uneven statements going out, it might be causing lumps in your inquiry volumes. Rather than just do the forecasting method, you could avoid that problem by working with them. You know, if a piece of direct mail or an email that goes out, what can you do? Is it possible to smooth out that over several days so that it doesn't give you one big hit that is really hard? Even if you forecast it accurately, it's hard to staff up to. Subject to it not interfering with the campaign itself, because the last thing you want to do is reduce the impact of the campaign. But a forecast analyst must network throughout the business in order to get the best results. Other things I see with the forecasting process is not measuring the error and not learning from the errors. It could be that there's an error. There could be a bias every Saturday, or it could be something that happened that just got forgotten about. But you've got to learn from the errors and make sure that it's fed back into the forecasting process, and not updating the forecasts frequently enough is something I see. So a forecast is made and then it's updated in 4 or 6 weeks' time. But in that time, all kinds of things happened that could have made that forecast more accurate.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one more, actually, come to think of it. If your forecasting is a weekly process and you're making short-term forecasts, what day do you make the forecasts and what day are they actually used? I've seen situations where a forecast is made on the Monday, but it's not actually used until the Thursday. And so you've lost out on so much insight, because what happened on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, you can use that information to make the most up-to-date forecasts for use on the Thursday. So I would say make your forecasts as late as you can get away with, because you'll have more insight to use.
I love that. And do you know what? I'm going to definitely take that back as well for a learning. Never thought about it. And
Yes.
been in that situation where, produced a forecast, or one of my teams, and maybe it's been a week later before it's even talked about.
Yes.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And that's something like the budget process might be 2 months long. But all the way through the budget process, you've got to update the forecasts, because a lot more gets known within that process.
So you touched on earlier when you were talking about machine learning and more complicated models beyond statistics. And obviously, this wouldn't be a podcast if we didn't touch upon AI. I know there's a lot of excitement around AI-driven forecasting, but how do you balance some of the excitement around AI forecasting with the need for operational reliability?
With respect to AI, I'm thinking about the machine learning models that are available through Python. And so that's what I think of. And I've been experimenting with a model available in Python, TimeGPT.
Yep.
Because TimeGPT looked at the VN1 data. It produced a forecast which put it into second place within the VN1 competition, but outperformed everyone that was second and below. In other experiments I've done with TimeGPT, it's not been quite as impressive. But I have to say that it was phenomenal that it did so well in just a matter of seconds. Full marks to Nixler, which creates that method. If you're accessing the machine learning models through Python, it gives you an extremely robust environment for you to experiment with these models. And Python or R or SAS, by coding it and by automating the work in code, it can become part of the process. And you can test the models under a wide range of conditions to see if they beat other methods that you have. And you can demonstrate that to the stakeholders.
Like you said, it regenerates something in seconds. So you can now reinvest that time into really improving the inputs by networking or really getting sharper in terms of the data.
Yes, in particular, the data. You have to find the data. You have to ensure its accuracy. You have to understand that it is causing variation within what you're trying to forecast. You have to get it into a format that an algorithm can use. So there's lots of work, for a human to do, engaging with the stakeholders, learning from the operation, and learning from the inputs. There's still plenty of work for a forecast analyst to do, even if some modeling is being taken over. I think I'll just pause and then make one point. If we have a single time series, for example, a contact type, and the only thing that causes the variation is the underlying trend and the seasonality, then a classical stats technique like Holt-Winters or ARIMA is going to do pretty much as well as a machine learning algorithm. And for certain time series, the classical stats techniques will be better than the machine learning. Where machine learning really helps is where you have multiple time series, where you have several different time series, where you can learn from one that helps in the other, and where you have complex interactions between what you're trying to forecast and other factors. And that's where the machine learning really works well.
So I want to just give some practical advice. So you're going into a center. What's your typical sort of 30-day plan for improving forecast accuracy in a center that's underperforming in terms of accuracy?
Yeah, I would do a diagnosis of what's happening within the operation against best practice. And I like to think about that in terms of 6 elements. The 6 elements are: how is data being used and exploited? What is the method or model being used? What's the software? What kind of process is in place? Is there a process? And if there is, let's critique it. There are people considerations. For example, the skills and experience and training of the individuals. And also visualizations. Charts are so fundamental to forecasting that they deserve a category to themselves. In terms of a game plan, it would depend on what's there, but I'll give you the sort of things that you might want to look at. Data. Ensure that the data is robust, well defined, and that the variation is understood. And I'm a big fan of keeping a diary, because if you have a spike or a dip in the volumes, very easy to forget what actually caused that. And 6 weeks is a long time in a contact center. So keep a diary of what caused the ups and downs, but understand that variation, make sure the data is accurate. Compare it to a moving average, whatever the forecast is. Look at other methods as well. What software is in place? There's WFM software, something in Excel, or SAS or Python. With respect to the process, what I would look to be implementing a regular process so that the short-term forecasts and the long-term forecasts are updated at least weekly, and so that the learnings can be reflected back into the forecasts. So whenever decisions are being made off the back of the forecasts and the resource requirements, they're always using the latest data, that there's error monitoring in place, and that the inputs coming from marketing or wherever, they are good, they are challenged, and that if you suspect the marketing forecast can be improved, you challenge them, have meetings, and if you challenge enough, you might end up taking on that forecasting. With people, there's all kinds of training that can be done, or things that can be done to improve experience, specific coaching for individuals. Often within the forecasting environment, there can be a lot of negative behaviors. I'm thinking of times where I've been forecasting in contact centers, and there's been a lot of sniping, there's been a lot of criticism, there's been a lot of blame. And it can be very demoralizing for a forecaster, and it can even cause the forecaster to not try anything new or not try anything because I better do as I'm told. And I've seen situations where forecasters have done as they're told as opposed to what they think is right. And the forecasts have been incredibly inaccurate. So there are huge people issues with forecasting. And then with respect to charts, how can charts improve the decision-making process? We can use charts to learn from the errors. We can use them to spot errors in our future forecasts because it's easier to see it looking wrong in a chart than in a table. Charts can help you make decisions, especially around budget time, especially when you have to incorporate judgment into the forecasts. So we're going to implement some new technology, which is going to automate 5, 10, 15, 20% of our contact types. A chart can help you with applying that judgment and applying it into the forecast. And charts are really good with stakeholder acceptance as well.
Philip, that's absolute gold advice. Actually, this whole podcast is full of really great advices. I could probably spend the next hour with you picking your brain.
There's a lot of ground we haven't covered, Doug, isn't there?
There's a lot of ground. Yeah, I'm definitely going to ask you to come back again on the podcast. But just for today, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the really super interesting insights. And
it's a pleasure, Doug.
The workforce management community is really going to be very thankful for your time and expertise. Thank you, Philip.